Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Dr. Maya Kornberg, the author of Stuck: How Money, Media, and Violence Prevent Change in Congress. This is her second book. She is a congressional scholar, a frequent public speaker, and a former candidate for New York City Council. Maya, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me here today.
Before we start our interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. AxelbankHistory.com is designed by Nikki Rideout of Ellie Claire Designs. It has our most recent episodes, our featured episodes, and a link to that Patreon page, so check out Nikki's work. In March of 2021, 2 months after January 6th, Americans felt sympathy for Congress. 36% told pollsters that they approved of those representing them in Washington. 5 years later, that number is near an all-time low. 10% say Congress is doing its job. Maya Kornberg says the explanation is clear, that the common refrain that Americans have never been so divided is a bit of a misdirection. She argues that there is a consensus that democracy only works for a select few, which is why Donald Trump and Zohran Mamdani sit where they sit. She argues the only way to improve America is through Congress. Now, Maya, if you could pass a law that would change the way Congress is either formed or how it operates, and you're the emperor, you don't have to pass a law, you can make the law. What would that law be to change the way Congress is formed or how it operates to make it better?
Well, I'll make it even easier. This is something that we can change without law. It's an internal rules change in Congress. And that's to change the way that Congress is organized and resourced. So part of the reason I argue, and my book tells a kind of 50-year story of how Congress became so stuck, part of the reason that it became so stuck is because it has several thousand fewer staffers than it did just a few decades ago. In the 90s, one journalist said that it self-lobotomized itself, and I think that is the right way to put it. It defunded entire congressional support agencies. It really made it a lot harder for itself to stand up to executive abuse of power. So it needs to fund itself, it needs to dramatically increase staffing and resources, and it needs to also reorganize itself. The last time that Congress reorganized its committee jurisdictions was in the 70s, before the internet existed. So, we're all shocked at why Congress can't regulate the tech industry. Well, they don't have a tech committee because the last time that they reorganized themselves, the internet did not exist. So, Congress needs to introspect and figure out how to organize itself for action. And again, all of those things require rules changes. Those are internal decisions. Those are not something that we need laws for. I can continue, and I think that there's other things that we need laws for that will also help Congress, like war powers reform and reforming the Impoundment Control Act and other things. But those two things that I listed, I think, are low-hanging fruit that Congress just has to take on.
I think the next obvious question here is why you decided on Congress being the linchpin. The power of the presidency in our system is massive. The power of the Supreme Court, it gets such definitive space to interpret our rules. Why and how did you decide that it needs to be the representatives of the people who have to guide us out of this cynicism?
So the framers, if we look back to the way that our country was designed, they actually designed Congress to be the central branch. I study not just Congress, but I've also worked in international development looking at legislatures, and I'm fascinated by legislatures because they are also the people's branch. They are the most representative branch, the branch that is meant to be most representative of the people. And for that reason, I think that legislatures in general and Congress in particular continue to be the central institution of our democracy. And I think that if we want to understand how we got here to a place where we also have an executive branch that is abusing power, we have to understand how Congress has also failed to stand up. So I also think that Congress, in relation to the executive, is another thing that makes it so important right now in this moment, and so urgent now in this moment, given the abuse of power that we're.
You went through some of the internal rules that Congress has established, but I want to ask about Article 1 itself. Focus on a couple of the sort of writs that Article 1 gives Congress, and maybe they're well intentioned, but perhaps some of them missed the boat in predicting how things would unfold in this system that the framers created. So, what in particular about Article 1 doesn't seem to be working?
The Constitution gives Congress several key authorities that it has ceded to the president. It gives it the right to declare war, and yet Congress has not declared war since World War II. And the book starts in the 1970s when Congress was trying to take back some of the war powers by doing something like pass the War Powers Resolution, which was passed in 1973 at the very end of the Vietnam War, and tried to constrain executive power in war. This has come up again now because the War Powers Resolution gives the president a 60-day window to get congressional authorization or terminate something, and of course, Trump is arguing that he terminated the war before the legal deadline. So this is very much a part of the conversation.
Yeah, he even says if I say the word war, I'll get in trouble. So I'm not going to say war. I'm going to call it an excursion or a conflict. And then that,
Exactly.
in his view, sort of kneecaps Congress's ability to regulate it.
Exactly. And I think that that speaks to another thing that I was going to get to with power of the purse, which is that, the Constitution gives Congress power to do things, but if it's not enforced and if the presidents, as we've seen them do, and this is, even accelerated in the Trump presidency, they find loopholes and they manipulate existing statutes. So another thing that the Constitution gives Congress the right to do is power of the purse, and that's a huge power. And yet, presidents have been taking increasingly central roles in budget negotiations for several decades now. And Congress passed also in the 1970s, which is why the book starts there. The 1970s were a time when Congress was standing up. Congress passes the Impoundment Control Act, and that is something that is meant to constrain the president's ability again, to usurp this power. But we see the president manipulating all these loopholes, things that are called, pocket rescissions or, the gray areas around, is it just a delay in using funding or am I just not giving funding? So there's all these loopholes. And what Congress needs to do right now, if you ask me, is strengthen these existing pieces of legislation so that we can, really close all the loopholes that are being manipulated. And that's a way that it can take back power.
In your view, Watergate is the seminal moment. That's why your book covers about 50 years. Before we get to the downfall of Congress, explain how efficiently and effectively Congress responded to the abuses of power that were waged by Richard Nixon. It's almost shocking to hear Congress react so quickly.
Mhm. So part of the reason that Congress reacted so quickly was because the Watergate scandal, and I would say also the backdrop here is also the increasingly costly and unpopular war in Vietnam, ushers in this new wave of reformers, which is where the book starts in the 1974 election, and the wave of over 90 new members that came to Congress. I argue that Congress is the most changeable, the most malleable when there's these wave elections that bring in new people, because otherwise it's a pretty sticky institution. And so this wave of reformers comes in and they're able to change the way that Congress is organized. Now, obviously, they're not the ones who started this. Bella Abzug, for example, a congresswoman who was already there in the 70s, is known to have said in a hearing when these new members come in, she turns on her mic and she says, reinforcements have arrived. So obviously, there were Democrats that were already there setting up all of these changes and key things like the War Powers Resolution or the Impoundment Control Act, were passed before this class came in. But I think that it speaks to a time when Congress is really trying to take back power. And I would argue that it's not the first time that it's tried to do that. I mean, it's a seminal moment, as you're saying. But even if we look at 1946, after World War II, Congress passes the Legislative Reorganization Act of 1946 because the president, they thought, had taken too much power in World War II. So there's these moments where Congress has an urgency to act. And if that's paired with a wave of new blood kind of coming in, that can really shake things up, I think, in really important ways.
The three elections that you point to are 1974, 1994, and 2018. Each were tied to an impeachment, as you say, or almost to an impeachment. What I guess 94. Eventually, there was an impeachment. What did you? I guess 18 too. What did you find in common with those three classes? Just in the personalities of the members, the new members who came into Congress, and then the case they made to the American people about what their role should be should they get elected.
So I chose these three classes because these are three of the largest groups of new members that have come into the House over the past 50 years. And as I was saying earlier, those are moments when Congress is really changing. And as you're saying, these are three inflection points in Congress's relationship with the executive because all three classes are tied to impeachment in different ways. But these are also three classes that, and I think this is because of the political moment in which those elections happened, the members they look different. They have different lived experiences than the people who were there before. All three classes are kind of younger than the members that are there before. All three classes are different in terms of having less legislative experience than the average member who's there and kind of different kinds of professional backgrounds. And in the case of the class of 2018, that's the most diverse class that Congress had seen to that point. So also record numbers of women and people of color, and again in a much more diverse Congress. And so with that kind of younger energy, freshness that comes, I think, with not being a career politician. Again, the book handles kind of the benefits and the challenges of not being a career politician and coming to Congress, but there is a freshness that comes with it uh, and um, and a different kind of lived experiences, these members are able to, I think, shake things up and decentralize power and change power in different ways. Obviously, in '94, it's a little bit different because the book tells a story of how Newt Gingrich is a really iron-handed speaker and takes advantage of some of the naivete. But I think on the whole, these classes are all kind of younger and fresher than the members who were there before.
The three sort of aspects of the book that you explore are violence, money, and media, and the impact that those are having on our Congress's ability to function and pass laws that could A, be potentially signed by the president, and B, could potentially improve the lives of Americans. First, let's talk about violence. You say the words are fear and exposure. There's a fear amongst potential members, people who might run, about being attacked or having their families exposed or having themselves exposed. What incidents are important for us to consider? Certainly, January 6th would be one thing, but more broadly here, what are people who are in Congress facing on a daily basis? And how does that fear of exposure impact their ability to be truly sort of elastic in what they can respond to and what sorts of bills they can propose and then muscle through the chamber?
So obviously January 6th is something that is etched in our collective memory, but as you're saying, every day there is violence and threats of violence that members are facing. According to the U.S. Capitol Police, between 2018 and 2023, threats of violence or acts of violence against members double in Congress, and then it's continued to rise since then. And so this violence, the book tells the story of how it distorts lawmaking in three key ways. First of all, members who I spoke to for the book, and the book is based on dozens of conversations with current and former members, they told me that they're afraid to go out and engage with constituents. And we live in a representative democracy, so that's pretty dangerous. One member told me that there's parts of her own district that she doesn't go to because she doesn't feel safe. Another member, Representative Scanlon, said, how could we not have the 2011 shooting of Gabby Giffords, which happened at a Congress at Your Corner event? How could we not have that in the back of our mind when we're doing these events? And of course, we recently saw Representative Ilhan Omar being attacked at a town hall. And so we're seeing members limit town halls or move them online or cancel them altogether. Which is hugely problematic in a representative democracy. Secondly, we're seeing members say, is it worth it? is it worth it to stay in office when I'm putting myself and my family at risk? And this is something that, and I've worked with colleagues at the Brennan Center on research about violence faced by state and local office holders. This is something that is a pipeline problem, this kind of attrition problem. So there's a quote in the book from Representative Angie Craig, who was assaulted by a man in her building in 2023, who says she thinks violence is the biggest deterrent in her conversations about, people running for office. And the book also quotes Nancy Pelosi's memoir, where she says that when she talks to young dynamic people thinking about running for Congress, and particularly young women, what they tell her is that what happened to Paul Pelosi, the violent attack against her husband, that's their biggest fear. So I think we have to take that very seriously, especially given the waves of retirements that we've seen recently.
There's a
And then, sorry.
Oh, I was going to say there's a member of, there was a hopeful member of Congress. She didn't end up winning, but she was running in a primary, and I went to interview her, and as I interview, many, many public officials, and she had a bodyguard who was clearly armed with her, and she hadn't even been elected yet. She wasn't in office yet. She, as far as I know, didn't face any threats, although I guess it's possible that she did. And she simply, we were meeting on a street corner. Nobody could have known she was going to be there, except, it wasn't an advertised event. And she
Yeah.
made sure that she was outside with somebody in her own community who was armed and could respond,
Yeah.
as I guess, as best as possible. And I thought, wow, what a risk she feels like she's taking here, just to meet a reporter who, again, it wasn't an advertised thing. No one could have known she was there.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, based on my research and based on having been a candidate, as you mentioned myself, I understand that. I mean, I did not go around with an armed bodyguard, but I did face threats and harassment while I was running. And my address was public at the time. And that does expose you and your family in different ways. And I'm proud to have been a part of a team at the Brennan Center that successfully advocated for the FEC to change their guidelines so that candidates could more easily spend campaign funds on security. And we're seeing them doing that more and more. So I do think it's an issue that unfortunately faces candidates. And I think that's particularly true because being a candidate, you're out in the field all the time, kind of exposed,
And
unlike
how does that
members of
stop?
Congress who are.
Yeah, and how
Sorry.
does that stop people from, even when they're in office, from
Mhm.
truly being reactive to what's going on out there, to write laws and then get them
Yeah.
passed?
Well, I'll give two kind of jarring examples that really stuck with me. First of all, members are saying, "I'm afraid to vote my conscience because of violence." So there's a quote from Liz Cheney in the book saying she knows Republican members who've said to her that they would have voted to impeach President Trump, but they were afraid for their safety or the safety of their families, which I think is pretty shocking, given what that means about the state of our democracy. I mentioned also earlier that I've done research and had many conversations with state and local office holders in my work. And I remember a conversation with one state office holder who told me that she really cares passionately about gun control, but she did not take that issue on when her sons were young because she was afraid they would face violence. And I heard similar stories from members of Congress about them shying away from hot button issues or not taking stances that they believed in because they were afraid of the violence, the threats, the harassment that they or their family might be subjected to. And again, I want to continue to underscore that a lot of this is increasingly also fear for their families and their family safety. So I think that cannot be understated.
How is money impacting all of this? There's certainly a dividing line in our democracy when it comes to money in politics, and that would be the Citizens United decision. But I want to ask, just in general, how does the influence of money, and these guys have to raise so much money, you probably have to raise to run in a competitive congressional seat at this point. You have to probably raise tens of millions of dollars if you're in an expensive media area.
Mhm.
So, how does that impact Congress members' ability to, as I put it before, see problems and fix problems?
So it's true that Citizens United was a huge turning point, but I would actually point out another turning point a little further back, which is the 1976 Supreme Court Buckley v. Valeo decision. So in that decision, the Supreme Court rules that spending limits are unconstitutional. for campaigns, and we see the amount of money in campaigns starting to rise. And then, of course, Citizens United is a decision where the Supreme Court rules that there can be unlimited outside spending, and that just, further escalates things. And so now we have a situation where, as you're saying, to run for Congress, you have to raise these astronomical amounts. And when you compare that to some of the stories that I tell in the book from the 1970s, like, for example, Elizabeth Holtzman, uh, Congresswoman here in Brooklyn, told me that she was running against an incumbent, mind you, congressman, and she was told you need to raise $100,000 to run against an incumbent, which is unfathomable right now. And she was actually only able to raise around $30,000, and she won that race. And again, even when we take inflation into account, it's just nothing compared to what you would have to raise right now. And so we hear a lot about that in campaigns, right? Just how that is excluding so many people from running for office when they don't have access to wealth. But the book talks about how that actually distorts lawmaking. And so members have to raise now money to pay dues to the party, to win leadership positions within the party, or to get on to kind of key committee assignments. They have to raise money. There's a quote, kind of a story in the book of Marcia Fudge, who represented a working class community in Cleveland area, saying to a staffer that she doesn't know how she's going to leverage that community in order to pay her dues to the party, which she has to pay now, not to win re-election, just to pay dues to the party. And so really it's distorting pathways to power even after folks are elected. And I think people don't realize that piece as much. And the second thing that I'd say is that, again, when we look at the waves of retirement right now, we have to keep this in mind, which is that members are just dialing for dollars all day long. One member told me he fundraises every mealtime. He spends every mealtime fundraising, which seems so miserable to me. That's just not a life that I think is sustainable for many of them. And so that really wears them down, and it takes a lot of time they could be spending legislating and doing things for the American people. So it's I think could not be more distorting of their schedules and of their incentive structures in terms of power building.
What can we do about the money aspect of this, given the Supreme Court where it is now? What solutions are there?
Well, I certainly think we need to continue to push for ending Citizens United. That might not be possible, as you're saying, in the current climate, but we have to continue to push for that. And I think we should be supportive of things like, for example, like what I had in New York City when I ran for council, which is a small donor public financing system where candidates can raise money with small dollar donations, and that's matched by public funds. We know that when we do that, that is a great equalizer because women, for example, when they run, are more likely to raise small dollar donations compared to male candidates. And that's true of other groups also with less access to wealth. So that was in HR 1 a few years ago, which didn't end up passing. To do that on a national level, I think we can continue to push for that. I think there's other things that we can continue to do to fight the influence of big money in politics. And I think that the American people certainly have an appetite for that if you look at public polling.
Tell me about the media here during Watergate, during 1994, during that whole era. The media was still largely consistent, though talk radio was kind of fracturing things at that point. How do you, though, think the fracturing of media, which now includes, frankly, hundreds of podcasts and hundreds of hosts and hundreds of yappers out there, and now there are at least three or four conservative TV channels, and there's what would still be considered, I guess, mainstream media. There are newspapers. There's all these different avenues to get information. How do you think that fracturing has paralyzed members of Congress' ability to be truly responsive? And I should say social media too, because all your friends have megaphones too.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I was going to list social media right at the beginning of my answer because I think that on the one hand, this has made it a lot easier for members to engage with constituents. Television cameras were introduced into Congress in the 80s. And I think that there's a lot more transparency now about what Congress does. We see, when AOC is elected, she's kind of streaming the orientation process. and saying, look at these swag bags that we got at orientation. Look at the tunnels that connect the Senate and the House, just making Congress more accessible to people, which is great. But the darker side of social media and of this media environment in general is that, especially as I mentioned, there's increasing pressure to fundraise, and that is happening online. That there's a incentive for members to be creating these soundbite moments, these theatrical moments, just the most salacious thing, the most negative,
Performative and yeah.
completely performative. Yeah. And that's not new with social media. Newt Gingrich, when television cameras were introduced into Congress, is known to have made speeches to an empty floor because he knows that someone is watching on television. And he is also known to have said, the media loves fights. So we're going to give them fights. He understood that. And I don't think he was wrong. And I think that when we look at what you started the conversation with, which is just the lack of trust in Congress, the incredibly low public approval ratings, part of that is certainly because the media tells the most negative story that it can find, from what I've seen about Congress and what's going on. And that's what sells. And that's what will get people donations. The book tells the story of Representative Wilson, Republican representative, yelling, "You lie," in the middle of Barack Obama's joint address to Congress in 2009. He used that to fundraise. He used that moment to fundraise. So again, the kind of needing to sensationalize things, the incentive towards Representative Underwood, who I interviewed for the book, called this an incentive structure that is about eyeballs and acclaim rather than substantive policymaking. When we think about how Congress can't deliver right now, I think that that is certainly a huge part of it. And I'll just end by saying that social media has also become, to our earlier conversation about violence, a huge vector for abuse for members. And they face a lot of threats and harassment online. And I think this is something that cannot be understated in terms of the impact that it's having.
I want to ask about you a little bit. You ran for city council a few years ago. What did you learn from that experience as it relates to the reasons that Congress is ineffective?
A lot of the problems that I just talked about, Congress is just a microcosm of them. These are systemic problems. And so, if you run for any level of office, I think in the United States, you experience this to differing degrees. You experience the ways in which, and as I mentioned, I was certainly, unfortunately, experienced this as well, the way in which people running even for local office now have to be subjected to threats and harassment online and in person that I do not think that we should be okay with as a society. I experience the ways in which media tends to sensationalize things and tell sometimes, again, the most sensational story rather than one that is accurate. And as I mentioned, I was lucky to be a small donor public financing candidate in New York City, where 90% of my donations were small donations. And I think for me, that was a great equalizer, and it really strengthened my resolve to continue to advocate for small donor public financing programs in New York City and New York State and nationally. I think that we have to continue to do things because that allowed me to be on the doors talking to folks, and I knocked thousands of doors when I ran, rather than just dialing for dollars. And that's the last thing I wanted to say about what I learned and what I think is true of Congress too. People want to be listened to. They want to be heard. And right now, there's a sense that Congress isn't listening. And when I was on the doors, there was a sense that government wasn't listening. And I think that we need to be making Congress and be making other levels of government a place where really the voices of ordinary Americans can be heard if we want to improve trust in government, if we want to, combat this huge disengagement that we're seeing and disillusionment with government.
How is it different being interviewed as a candidate for office versus being interviewed for a book like this one?
That's an interesting question. No one has actually ever asked me that. I think that being interviewed and the kind of relationship that I had with the media as a candidate is a very different relationship than you have with the media as an expert. Again, I think that um, the media, and this is perhaps true of experts too, but when it comes to campaigns, frequently I think that they're trying to tell a story and you're trying to tell a story about your brand. Part of that is telling a story about your vision, and that certainly was true for me of what needs to change in our government. But part of it is trying to tell a specific story about a race. Whereas when I'm writing a book, the book obviously has a vision for policy reform, and that's what it ends with. But it wants to help us understand something, right? That's what I'm doing as an expert. Now, I believe in doing both of those things and have done both of those things in my career because I think they go hand in hand. I think we have to understand how we got here, deeply understand how we got here in order to unstick things. But as a politician, you're really talking about the solutions and you're really talking about that specific story and that specific brand and that specific vision in that moment. Whereas as a scholar and as an expert, you're talking about how we got here and the questions and I think the deeper explanation. And so the conversations that you will have with the media are very different, I think, as a result of that.
You worked at the UN in the Middle East, which is incredible. You also apparently speak Arabic and Hebrew. What have you learned from observing other legislative bodies and cultures that you think could inform our own views of Congress and also inform members of Congress itself about how they could operate their branch better?
Congress left the Interparliamentary Union. It is frequently not compared, both in academic political science and in international work, to other legislatures. And there's so many things that can be learned, from the amazing civic engagement processes of the House of Commons in the United Kingdom, or the way in which, in Brazil, people can send in videos with sign language to and make phone calls and engage with the legislature in so many ways that are more accessible than the United States, or the way in which Taiwan is using AI for engagement processes. There's so many things that we can learn, and I think we need to be a part of the conversation. And the other thing that I've learned from this experience that I've had kind of doing work cross-culturally that I think is relevant in the United States, which is a very diverse country in which a lot of the communication has to be cross-cultural, is that you have to meet people where they are. You have to be able, as a parliament and as a legislature, to communicate with people in their language, on the social media platforms that they engage on the topics that they care about. And that means, meeting different people where they are and not just communicating in one language through one, media landscape at one time. You have to do that, I think, and that's the way to bring people back into the conversation.
What's one rule that another Congress or legislative branch operates with that you think would be particularly effective here in the United States?
Well, firstly, I don't know if it's a rule, but when we look at, for example, the United Kingdom, much smaller country landmass wise, they actually have regional offices where the parliament can meet people where they are, as I was saying, not just in Westminster. And there's folks who speak the local languages, of which there are many in the United Kingdom, and can help kind of bridge that gap and bring members of parliament to meet people where they are. Now, in the United States, which is a huge country, not only do we not have regional offices, we also don't have enough field hearings. We also don't even allow, we did this for a little bit during COVID, but then we stopped, witnesses to testify virtually. So, you have to travel to DC in order to testify or just be based in DC. So, not only is Congress not doing enough traveling around the country, meeting people and, just listening to where they are, it's also making it even harder for people to even virtually engage with Congress in a way that they do in other countries. And again, in a way that privileges people who have both the physical ability to travel to DC, the funds to travel to DC, when Congress doesn't pay for them to come testify. So maybe it's a lobbying firm that's paying for them to come testify, and the networks to know people in the DC area. So I think it's just very, very hard to engage with Congress compared to engaging with the British House of Commons. And that's just one example. There's many other countries that are doing it better than us.
The US is probably what, 10 times as big as Great Britain, maybe even more in terms of geography. How much does geography play a role? For instance, Florida is relatively close to Washington compared to some other states, and it feels like a world away. I mean, you have to take a flight, and it's at least a whole day to get there, or say once you're there, you're not going to come back the same day generally, so it takes a couple of days out of your life to go up there and testify or to observe. How much does the distance that most Americans have to Washington impact the branch's ability to function?
Oh, I think it makes a tremendous difference because, again, I'm concerned with how Congress as a branch can be a space that is actually responsive to the voices of ordinary Americans. And when we don't have the voices of ordinary Americans heard in committee hearings, which are like perhaps the classic tool for engagement in Congress, or in other spaces, then we can't have a Congress that is truly representative. And so, for example, a few years ago, with the Farm Bill, the Agriculture Committee in the House, they did a listening tour, and I spoke to them for my first book about that. And that listening tour was them just doing open mic sessions with farmers and, folks who had a stake in that bill around the country. And they told me what a different experience that was to just do these open mic sessions, to travel around the country together as a committee, to do that kind of thing. And so that's why I think that, again, we need to meet these people where they are in their local communities because they don't have the funds or the ability or the time or the resources to necessarily travel to DC. And we were talking earlier about my council campaign. I think that's true of even local engagement processes in the United States. I frequently argued in my campaign, and I continue to argue this, that even community boards in a place like New York City are not accessible to folks when the meetings happen during bedtime in a particular part of the district. There's no transportation subsidy, there's no childcare subsidy. We need to think about actually creating engagement processes that meet people where they are.
You're talking like a parent of young kids. I can tell that.
Yeah.
Um, you're a senior fellow at the Elections and Government program at the NYU Brennan Center for Justice. Explain what that is and what you work on there.
hmm So the Brennan Center, we like to talk about ourselves as a multi-pronged organization. We do a lot of advocacy, as I mentioned, to change things. When it comes to money in politics, to campaigns, when it comes to voting rights and elections in this country, which is particularly important in this moment as we are up against threats to another big important election coming up in November. We do work on things like gerrymandering and liberty and national security and so many different issues as a center when it comes to boots on the ground and advocacy and working with other advocates. We are a communications hub. So a lot of the work that we do is translating these big and sometimes opaque and technical ways in which government works into digestible pieces of communication where we can get our message across in the court of public opinion. And lastly, I'm a social scientist. There's other social scientists at the Brennan Center, and we're a think tank. We're a research hub within the law school. And we continue to do rigorous academic research on all of these topics that I just mentioned. I think that it is particularly important that the work that we're doing right now in the midst of the four-alarm fire that we're seeing for our democracy. So I'm very proud to be working with my colleagues at the Brennan Center again on all these issues that I just mentioned.
You did a few interviews for this book. Were the members of Congress who you interviewed excited and open to talk to you about it, particularly because you come from it from a solutions point of view?
That's a good question. Yeah, so I, did interview dozens of both lawmakers and staff for the book, current and former, from the classes that I look at the book. And the members were, I thought, remarkably frank and eager to talk. And maybe that was because I was coming from a solutions point of view, but I also think that it's because they want someone to listen to them. I think frequently what they get is just people berating them. We just talked about the approval ratings of Congress. It's not a very popular organization. And so someone just coming and listening to them about what they do, about how hard it is to do the work that they do, I think that there is actually more thirst for that than we realize. I think that members of Congress, like other people, they want to be listened to, they want to be heard. And I think right now they want to tell their story in a way that does also, I think, highlight the challenges that they face when they get to Congress. I think that we elect people and we just expect them to magically change everything. But my book talks about the structural challenges that make it so much harder for them to make change. And I think that they were very eager to talk about that and to talk about their vision for reform and very frank with me in the conversations that we had.
All right, gerrymandering. You just mentioned it. What's your view of this? How dangerous is this? From a partisan perspective, people say, hey, we've got to stack our seats up no matter what the cost. But I am very concerned that no matter which side, and there are two major parties in the United States, no matter which side is doing it, you're making the contest a matter of an internal squabble between party members, and basically these candidates now are going to have to solely impress members of their own party to get elected. How concerning is that?
I think it's extremely concerning. And while I am not a gerrymandering expert, I'm a congressional expert. I really am inspired by all the work that colleagues at the Brennan Center are doing, especially in the wake of the recent Supreme Court decision that we saw this week, that further hollowed out the crown jewel of voting rights in the United States, the Voting Rights Act, and diluted the quality of representation. So I think ending partisan gerrymandering is extremely important for democracy. And I also think, though, and again, this is with my congressional scholar hat back on, that we need to think about things like expanding the size of the House of Representatives. When we think about representation, members of Congress, I've mentioned several times the kind of framers and the vision that they had for Congress. George Washington was adamant in early conversations about how Congress was going to be organized, that members of Congress only represent 30,000 people, that they not represent too many people, because that is going to make it harder for them to represent people. Right now, they represent nearly 1 million people. And so when we
Yeah, I was gonna
talk
say
about how
three
hard it
quarters of
is,
a million people. Yeah.
exactly. So when we talk about how hard it is to engage with, farmers about the Farm Bill, that is so much harder when you represent so many people. And so I think when it comes to the way that the body is organized, certainly banning partisan gerrymandering is important, but also expanding the size of the House in a way that it can keep pace with the growing country.
What is the best example, the most recent example that we have of Congress tackling and solving a tough problem?
That's a tough question to say. Obviously we saw, the ACA and Biden's infrastructure bill and major pieces of legislation getting passed that have a tremendous impact on people's life. So when we see Congress and has become less productive recently, we do have to view that in the context of these major changes happening that continue to impact the lives of everyday Americans. And we're seeing Congress, try to take on things like the War Powers Resolution reform and other things and try to stand up to the president. I think in certain instances, perhaps not enough. But we are seeing, I think, some movement of Congress as a branch, both on policy issues that impact Americans, and in kind of trying to stand up on things like war powers.
But what happens is during an administration, it happened during Biden, it happened during Trump, to some extent, it happened during Obama with Obamacare. What seems to happen is they sign one piece of legislation that has like 100 things in it,
Yes.
and they call that their legislative achievement, and they all stuff the bill with a million things. People barely know what's in it because there are a million provisions. Some of it has to do with research funding, and then you have tax cuts, and then you have uh, changes in, just about everything under the sun. Why is that happening?
Part of that, and I think you're correct to point out this kind of trend where Congress is passing fewer bills and then pushing everything into a few bills that they do pass, is the breakdown of what we call regular order in Congress, just a complete kind of overhaul of the system. The schoolhouse rock version of how Congress functions, which is that bills are introduced and they're sent to a committee, and then the committee deliberates, and the committees are the kind of legislative concourse where people can deliberate and learn about an issue and mark up a bill and then send it back for a vote. That has completely broken down as a result, partially of some of the changes that I have um, documented in the book. But what we have now is a system in which power is so centralized in party leadership in Congress that we have party leaders, sometimes with the help of a few lobbyists, writing bills and pushing them down very quickly for a vote, in many instances bypassing the committee process. And there are instances where members are saying, I didn't even have time to read this bill before I had to vote on it. So again, we're spending a lot of time and money electing people to Congress, and then they have much less legislative power than they used to actually do things if they can't even read a bill before they vote on it.
How do we fight the belief that my congressman is good, but the rest of Congress is bad? What do we do about that?
Yeah, and I think you're speaking to something that we see often, which is that members of Congress individually can be very popular while the institution is unpopular. That's a paradox that we see.
It's all the 434 other members' fault, not my own congressperson.
Right. And I think that we fight that by doing things like I was talking about earlier. What if the institution, what if committees did listening tours? What if we brought Congress to your corner more often and members didn't have to worry about, Gabby Giffords getting shot at a Congress at your corner event? What if we brought Congress to people in a tangible way and showed them the way that it delivered? The Welsh Parliament, and I don't know, it's not only that island that I'm thinking about in terms of engagement examples, but it's just top of mind for me. The Welsh Parliament has something called You Said We Did. As a campaign. So, they do an engagement process and then they show people what they did with their feedback. That's like an obvious thing when you want to build trust with someone. You can't just ask them what they think and then go away and never talk to them again. And so that's the kind of thing, that feedback loop, that continuous conversation. We need that. We need Congress to be meeting people where they are and explaining to people how things work, not just at the visitor center when people travel to DC.
Who in particular have you identified in each party who is doing a good job, who is reactive and pushing legislation that could improve lives?
There's so many members that I spoke to that I think would fit the bill for that, current and former, and from both parties and different ideological perspectives. But I think that I would kind of point to people that I see as kind of savvy reformers, people who know how to operate in the system. And the book talks about kind of things that they have in common. So, for example, Lauren Underwood or Andy Kim, who the book talks about in the class of 2018 chapter, they got to Congress and they understood, okay, it is a hierarchical organization. And so I'm going to know how to find windows where doors are closed and how to operate within the system. And they both immediately set up meetings with senior members and tried to build relationships. And Lauren Underwood, who cared tremendously about Black maternal health as an issue that affects so many lives of Americans, she teamed up with Alma Adams, a senior member, to create the Black Maternal Health Caucus and to push forward policy change that really advanced maternal health care at a time when there is a crisis of maternal health in the United States that disproportionately affects Black women and women of color more broadly. So again, that's an example of someone who knew how to operate within the system. And there are many other examples. Class of 2018, I also talked about their collective power. They got to Congress and they told me that Nancy Pelosi called them up, obviously, and needed their votes for speaker. And they understood that she needed their votes for speaker. And so they could bargain with her, even in a hierarchical system, and say, okay, give us ownership over, chunks of HR1, which was a major Democratic priority at the time, or, give us more seats on key committees than you would normally give freshman members. So I think understanding how to navigate the system, understanding how to open windows when doors are closed, how to compromise, how to have those relationships, that's what makes effective reformers in Congress today.
All right, what about you? Do you think you're going to try it again? Are you going to run for office again?
That's a big question. I don't know. I think that what I can say is that I have spent my whole career focused on making democracy work better for the people that it's meant to serve, and that is why I ran for office. And that is what I continue to do in my work. So whether that be in public office or whether that be continuing to do the work that I do as a scholar and as an advocate, that is where my heart is, and that is what I will continue to dedicate my life
All right.
to.
I'm going to give you the reporter's answer there and say that's not a no. That's not a no. There you go. Um, your dedication is for Liam and Noah with love. I'm assuming I can guess who they are, but who are Liam and Noah, and why did you dedicate the book to them?
So I actually wrote the book during the period in which I was pregnant with my son, Liam, and during the early months of his infancy. And certainly being the parent now of a toddler, I think that I even more so have a stake in our future, and want to see it be a future in which he can thrive, in which the next generation of Americans can grow up in a thriving democracy. And then, of course, the book is dedicated to my partner, who, as I mentioned in the dedication, makes all the work that I do possible.
That's Noah.
Yeah.
Okay. What's next for you? Do you think you'll do another book? Is there something percolating within you that you think deserves to be explored in this format?
You're asking some big questions today. Again, I don't know. I think that I loved the creative process of writing a book. I love listening to people and their stories, and studying a problem and figuring out how to use all of that knowledge towards tangible solutions that we put forward. So I will continue to operate in that space. And I will continue to try to make this space that scholarship and academia has in public conversations larger. I will say that I think that part of the problem in academic political science right now is that it is not geared enough towards actual policy change, that academics do not know enough how to translate their research or don't have incentives enough to translate their research into things that matter, that change lives. And I think that that's what we should be taking scholarship towards. And as I mentioned at the outset, I think that we need to pair thinking and understanding how we got here with solutions if we want smarter solutions.
All right. No more big questions. Dr. Maya Kornberg, the author of Stuck: How Money, Media, and Violence Prevent Change in Congress. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation.
I did too. Check out the book and also her website, mayakornberg.com. I want to invite listeners to go to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. AxelBankHistory.com is designed by Nikki Rideout of Ellie Claire Designs. It has our most recent episodes, our featured episodes, and a link to that Patreon page. So check out Nikki's work. And thank you for listening to Axelbank Reports, History and Today. Conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axelbank History. We'll see you next time. Thanks.